When you see the same tactics repeated in city after city, when you see coordinated attacks on federal buildings, when you see people showing up with identical gear and strategies, that's not spontaneous anger. That's organization. And here's where it gets interesting. For the longest time, we were told this was just an idea. You'd hear politicians and talking heads on cable news say, Antifa isn't really a group, it's just anti-fascism. It's just people angry about injustice. But ideas don't throw Molotov cocktails. Ideas don't coordinate tactical responses across multiple cities. Ideas don't have logistics chains that supply masks, shields, and incendiary devices to hundreds of people simultaneously. So what changed? What made this scattered network of angry protesters into something more formidable? Well, the same thing that makes any movement powerful: infrastructure, communication, and most importantly, funding. You see, movements need money. They need it for travel, for equipment, for legal support when members get arrested. And when you start following that money trail, things get very serious very quickly. Think about it like this. Imagine you're trying to water a garden. You can have the most dedicated gardeners in the world, but without a water source, nothing grows. Cut off the water supply, and even the hardiest plants wither. The same principle applies to any organization, whether it's a charity, a business, or, yes, a militant activist network. Money is the water that keeps everything alive. And for years, that water was flowing freely. Various nonprofits, donor networks, activist organizations, they all played a role in building the infrastructure that supported street-level action. Some of this was direct, some of it was indirect: legal defense funds, bail funds, communications platforms, training programs. All of it required resources, and all of those resources had to come from somewhere. Now, I want you to imagine living in one of these cities during the height of the violence. You own a small shop. Maybe it's a diner, maybe it's a bookstore, maybe it's a clothing boutique. You built this business from nothing. You put your savings into it, your time, your dreams. And one night, a mob comes through and smashes your windows, loots your inventory, maybe even sets fire to your building. The next morning, you're standing in the rubble, and the local authorities tell you there's nothing they can do. The insurance might not cover it. You're on your own. That's the emotional reality that millions of Americans live through. And it wasn't abstract political theater, it was their lives being destroyed. It was their sense of safety being shattered. And for what? What was actually being accomplished beyond destruction and fear? But here's the thing about chaos: it only lasts as long as people tolerate it. Eventually, the pendulum swings back. Eventually, people demand accountability. And when the federal government finally decides to treat organized violence as what it actually is, terrorism, everything changes. So let's talk about what's happening right now. In late September of this year, for the first time, we're seeing mass arrests of individuals identified as Antifa militants, and they're not being charged with simple assault or vandalism. They're being charged under terrorism statutes. This is a seismic shift in how the legal system approaches these cases. The catalyst was an incident in Eugene, Oregon, at an ICE facility. Federal officers were conducting enforcement operations, and a group showed up not to peacefully protest, but to attack. They threw objects at agents, they vandalized federal property, they attempted to intimidate and terrorize law enforcement officers who were simply doing their jobs. This wasn't civil disobedience. This was coordinated assault. And this came right on the heels of something even more disturbing: the Dallas ICE shooting. A detainee was killed, 2 others wounded. The shooter left behind explicit notes saying he wanted to maximize casualties among federal agents. He inscribed anti-ICE messages on his ammunition. He used tracking apps that some in the media had actually promoted, apps designed to help people locate and monitor ICE agents' movements. The apps were supposedly to help undocumented immigrants avoid enforcement, but in the wrong hands, they became tools for targeting. You have to pause and think about that for a moment. Technology that was praised as humanitarian was weaponized to hunt federal law enforcement. And when that became clear, when someone used those tools to carry out an attack that killed and wounded people, the calculus changed. Suddenly, it wasn't about free speech or activism anymore. It was about preventing the next attack. So the administration acted swiftly. Federal agents moved in on multiple Antifa militants in Eugene. They arrested them en masse. And for the first time in American history, these individuals are being prosecuted not as rowdy protesters, but as terrorists. That word matters. That designation carries weight. Because once you label a group a terrorist organization, once you start charging individuals under those statutes, the government's toolkit expands dramatically. Let me explain how this works in simple terms. Under normal circumstances, if someone commits assault or vandalism, they get charged with those specific crimes. The penalties are limited. The investigation focuses on that individual act. But terrorism charges are different. Terrorism charges allow prosecutors to look at the bigger picture, the network, the funding, the coordination. It's not just about what one person did on one night. It's about the entire structure that enabled and encouraged that action. And here's where it gets even more powerful. There's a legal framework called RICO, the Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act. It was originally designed to take down organized crime syndicates, the mafia, cartels. The idea is simple but devastating. If you can prove that an organization exists to commit crimes, you can prosecute not just the people who pulled the trigger or threw the brick, but everyone who supported them. The people who funded them, the people who housed them, the people who provided logistics. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to shut down an operation. You could arrest the street dealers one by one, but they'd just be replaced. Or you could go after the whole network, the suppliers, the money launderers, the landlords who rent properties for substance houses, the accountants who hide the profits. When you dismantle the entire structure, the operation collapses. That's what RICO does. And when you combine RICO with a terrorism designation, you create a legal hammer that can shatter an organization from the inside out. Because suddenly, anyone associated with the group faces serious risk. Banks that process their transactions can be investigated. Landlords who rent to known members can be held liable. Schools or organizations that provide platforms or resources can be implicated. The goal isn't just to arrest the people in the streets, it's to cut off every source of support, every avenue of funding, every node in the network. Now, you might be wondering, who's funding all this in the first place? Where does the money actually come from? Well, that's where things get really interesting and really uncomfortable for some very wealthy and powerful people. There have been allegations for years that various billionaire-funded networks and nonprofits have played a role in supporting activist movements, including those involved in street violence. Some of this support is indirect funding, legal defense, supporting bail funds, financing, media campaigns that justify or minimize the violence. Some of it might be more direct, though proving that in court is another matter entirely. But here's what we do know. Shortly after the first wave of arrests in Eugene, shortly after the terrorism charges were announced, something unusual happened. George Soros's Open Society Foundations released a public statement. In it, they unequivocally condemned terrorism. They distanced themselves from any connection to violent acts. And they called the administration's threats to investigate them politically motivated attacks. Now, why would they release such a statement at that particular moment? Timing is everything. You don't issue a defensive public denial unless you feel threatened. And sources suggest that subpoenas may have already been served, demanding financial records, bank statements, donor lists. If that's true, then the investigations aren't theoretical anymore. They're happening right now. And this is where the real power of the crackdown becomes clear. You see, organizations like the Open Society Foundations operate globally. They have billions in assets. They fund thousands of initiatives worldwide. If federal prosecutors start freezing accounts, if they start scrutinizing every transaction, if they start pursuing RICO charges that could implicate the entire network in supporting domestic terrorism, well, that's an existential threat. For someone in their position, the very fact that they're even being investigated under these statutes is catastrophic. Because RICO doesn't just threaten individuals, it threatens the organization itself. It can result in asset forfeiture, in the dismantling of entire foundations. Even if you're never convicted, even if you ultimately prove your innocence, the investigation alone can cripple your operations. So when you see a panicked public statement denying involvement, when you see organizations scrambling to distance themselves, that tells you the pressure is real. That tells you the administration isn't bluffing. They're serious about following the money all the way to the top. And here's the thing, this approach has historical precedent. When the federal government decides to destroy an organization, when they deploy the full weight of terrorism designations and RICO prosecutions, they usually succeed. We've seen it with organized crime. We've seen it with cartels. We've seen it with foreign terrorist groups. The pattern is always the same. Isolate the structure, cut off the funding, criminalize association, and watch it collapse. But let's zoom out for a second and talk about what this means in the bigger picture. Because Antifa isn't happening in a vacuum. The crackdown on domestic militant groups is part of a broader strategy to restore order and accountability across the board.
We're seeing similar moves against cartels, against foreign influence operations, against any organization that threatens the safety and stability of American communities.
And you know what? For a lot of people, especially those who lived through the chaos of recent years, this feels like a long overdue reckoning. It feels like someone finally said, enough. No more excuses. No more looking the other way. If you commit violence, if you terrorize communities, if you attack law enforcement, there will be consequences. That message resonates deeply with seniors, with families, with small business owners, because you value stability, you value the rule of law. You remember what it was like when communities were safe, when you didn't have to worry about mobs destroying your neighborhood, and when you see the government finally taking decisive action, it gives you hope that maybe, just maybe, we're turning a corner. But here's the question we have to wrestle with. Is this really the end of Antifa, or is it just the beginning of something else? On one hand, you have all the elements in place for the collapse of the organization. The funding is being threatened. The legal pressure is mounting. The first arrests have been made under terrorism statutes. The network is being dismantled piece by piece. If the money dries up, if key organizers are prosecuted, if supporting the group becomes legally toxic, it's hard to see how the organization survives in any meaningful way. On the other hand, ideologies don't die just because organizations do. You can arrest every member, you can freeze every bank account, you can dismantle every network, but you can't arrest an idea. And the ideology that fuels groups like Antifa, the anger, the resentment, the belief that violent resistance is justified, that doesn't disappear overnight. So maybe the question isn't whether Antifa as an organization will end. Maybe the real question is whether the conditions that created it, the grievances it exploited, the culture that allowed it to flourish, will change as well. Because that's the deeper challenge. You see, movements like this don't emerge from nowhere. They grow in environments where people feel like the system has failed them, where institutions aren't trusted, where grievances, real or perceived, go unaddressed. And yes, some of those grievances get manipulated, exploited by bad actors who want chaos rather than solutions, but the underlying conditions matter. So if we want Antifa to truly end, it's not enough to just arrest people and freeze bank accounts. We also need communities to rebuild trust. We need local governments to be responsive and accountable. We need people to feel like they have a voice that matters, that they can affect change through legitimate channels rather than violence in the streets. And this is where you come in, because the real power to stop movements like Antifa doesn't ultimately rest with federal agents or prosecutors. It rests with ordinary citizens, with people like you who show up to school board meetings, who vote in local elections, who hold mayors and city councils accountable. When communities are strong, when people feel connected and invested in their neighborhoods, militant extremism can't take root. Now, let's talk about something that's been fascinating to watch throughout all of this, the role of media and how the narrative around Antifa has shifted. For years, if you turned on certain cable news channels, you'd hear a very particular story. You'd hear that Antifa was mostly peaceful, that the violence was exaggerated, that it was just frustrated citizens exercising their right to protest. Some commentators went so far as to say Antifa wasn't even a real organization, just an idea, just a sentiment, and For a while, that narrative held. People who pointed out the coordinated nature of the violence, who documented the attacks on federal buildings, who showed the organized tactics, they were dismissed as alarmists or conspiracy theorists. The legacy media circled the wagons and defended the narrative that this was all spontaneous, grassroots activism. But here's the thing about narratives: they only work as long as reality cooperates. And when reality starts contradicting the story you're telling, when federal agents are getting shot, when detainees are killed, when entire city blocks are destroyed eventually, the narrative collapses under its own weight. We're seeing that collapse happening right now. CNN's ratings have been in free fall for years. MSNBC, same story. The traditional gatekeepers of information are losing their grip, and it's not because of some conspiracy. It's because people don't trust them anymore. They've watched these outlets spin stories, downplay violence, excuse destruction, and then they look out their window and see something completely different. Meanwhile, independent voices are rising. Podcasts, online commentators, citizen journalists with smartphones capturing what's actually happening in real time. These sources are becoming the dominant media. And you know why? Because they're willing to call things what they are. They're not trying to massage the message to fit a political narrative. They're just showing you what's happening and letting you make up your own mind. And that shift in how people consume information is having real consequences. When the first arrests in Eugene were announced, when the terrorism charges were revealed, the legacy media tried to spin it as authoritarian overreach. But this time, it didn't work. Too many people had seen the violence with their own eyes. Too many communities had suffered the consequences. The old playbook just didn't land anymore. So, when Eric Swalwell, the congressman from California, went on CNN and threatened prosecutors, saying he was keeping a list, promising that when Democrats regain power, they'd come after anyone involved in these investigations, it backfired spectacularly. Because people heard that and thought, wait, you're threatening the people trying to stop terrorism. You're promising revenge against law enforcement for doing their jobs. It was tone deaf. It was revealing. And the anchor interviewing him didn't push back, didn't challenge the premise, just nodded along. That's the kind of moment that crystallizes for viewers why they've stopped trusting these outlets. They're not journalists anymore, they're activists with cameras. But here's what gives me hope. The fact that people are tuning out the propaganda and seeking truth on their own terms, that's powerful. That's a sign that Americans aren't as easily manipulated as some elites seem to think. You've lived long enough to recognize when you're being sold a story versus when you're being told the truth. And that wisdom, that skepticism, that's a defense against extremism on all sides. So let's get to the heart of the matter. Is this really the end of Antifa? Let's weigh both sides honestly. On the side of, yes, this is the end, you have some very compelling evidence. The designation as a domestic terrorist organization is unprecedented. The legal tools being deployed, RICO statutes, asset freezes, the criminalization of material support, these are the same tools that dismantled the mafia, that broke drug cartels, that destroyed international terror networks. They work, they're effective. The first arrests have already happened. People are facing decades in prison, not just months. And more importantly, the investigation into funding is underway. If prosecutors can prove that major donors and foundations knowingly supported an organization engaged in terrorism, the financial consequences will be catastrophic. We're not talking about fines here. We're talking about the seizure of billions in assets, the dissolution of entire organizations. When the money dries up, the structure collapses. It's that simple. No funding means no coordination. No coordination means no large-scale operations. You might still have isolated incidents, angry individuals acting alone, but the organized, multi-city tactical operations, those require resources, and those resources are being systematically eliminated. Plus, there's the psychological impact. Right now, anyone associated with Antifa is facing a choice. Do you stay involved and risk being prosecuted as a terrorist, potentially spending the rest of your life in prison? Or do you Walk away, distance yourself, hope the investigators never connect you to anything actionable. For most people, that's not a hard choice. Self-preservation wins. And as more people peel away, as the network fragments, it becomes harder and harder to sustain any kind of coordinated action. So from that perspective, yes, we're watching the end of Antifa as an effective organization. Not overnight, these things take time. But the trajectory is clear. Within a year or two, it's entirely possible that Antifa as we know it simply ceases to exist in any meaningful way. But let's consider the other side. Let's think about why this might not be the end, or at least not the final chapter. First, ideologies are resilient. You can destroy an organization, but the beliefs that animated it don't disappear. There are still people out there who genuinely believe that the system is irredeemably corrupt, that violence is justified, that burning it all down is the only path to justice. Those people don't stop believing just because their organization gets labeled and prosecuted. History is full of examples of movements that went underground after crackdowns, only to reemerge later under different names, with different tactics. The ideology adapts, the structure evolves. Maybe you can't call yourself Antifa anymore, but you rebrand, you reorganize, you find new ways to channel that anger and resentment. Second, let's be honest about the conditions that created this in the first place. If people feel excluded from the political process, if they feel like their voices don't matter, if they see corruption and injustice going unpunished, that fertile ground for extremism remains. You can arrest every current member of Antifa, but if the underlying grievances aren't addressed, someone else will fill that void. And third, there's the question of martyrdom. When you prosecute people as terrorists, when you shut down organizations, you run the risk of creating martyrs. There will be people who view those arrested as heroes, as freedom fighters standing up to an oppressive system. And that narrative, however distorted, can inspire the next generation of militants. So from this perspective, Antifa as a brand might end, but the phenomenon it represents violent, anti-establishment extremism that might just take a different form. Maybe it goes quieter, more decentralized. Maybe it merges with other movements. Maybe it lies dormant for a few years and resurfaces when conditions change. So which is it? Is this the end, or just a new chapter? Honestly, I think the answer is both. I think we're watching the end of Antifa as an organized, coordinated force capable of sustained operations across multiple cities. The legal and financial pressure is too intense, the consequences are too severe, the network will collapse. But I also think the ideology won't disappear. There will still be individuals who believe violence is the answer. There will still be grievances that fester. There will still be attempts to organize resistance, even if it looks different than it did before. So, what determines the outcome? What decides whether this is truly the end, or just a temporary setback before the next wave? In my view, it comes down to three things. First, sustained political will. The crackdown has to continue. The investigations have to be thorough. The prosecutions have to result in convictions. If the pressure lets up, if the next administration decides to back off, if donors and organizers think they can wait this out, then the network rebuilds. But if the legal hammer keeps falling, if every attempt to reorganize is met with immediate consequences, then the organization stays dead. Second, cultural pushback. Communities have to reject the ideology, not just the organization. That means calling out violence when you see it, no matter what side it's coming from. It means defending the rule of law even when it's inconvenient. It means building strong, connected neighborhoods where people don't feel like extremism is their only option. And third, addressing legitimate grievances. Look, not everyone involved in these movements was a bad person. Some of them genuinely believed they were fighting injustice. The problem was the tactics, the violence, the destruction. But if we want to prevent the next Antifa, we have to create pathways for people to address their concerns without resorting to extremism. That means responsive government. That means accountability for corruption. That means making sure people feel like they have a stake in the system. And this is where your role becomes critical, because the future isn't decided by federal prosecutors or politicians in Washington. It's decided by what happens in your community, in your city, in your neighborhood. Are you voting for local officials who prioritize safety and order? Are you showing up to school board meetings when extremist ideologies are being pushed on kids? Are you supporting businesses that got destroyed and helping them rebuild? Are you engaging with younger generations, showing them that there's a better way than violence and destruction? These might seem like small actions, but they're the foundation of everything. Strong communities are the ultimate defense against extremism. When people feel connected, when they feel heard, when they see that their efforts can make a real difference, they don't turn to militancy. They build, they create, they solve problems. So let me tell you what I think the lessons are here, the takeaways that matter. First, law and order isn't optional. It's not negotiable. When communities allow violence to go unchecked, when they excuse destruction in the name of activism, they're not being compassionate or understanding. They're enabling chaos that will eventually consume them. The crackdown on ANTIFA is a reminder that society has the tools to defend itself, and sometimes it has to use them. Second, follow the money. Always. If you want to understand any movement, any organization, any cause, look at who's funding it. Because money leaves trails. And when those trails lead to powerful people and institutions, when the funding sources are exposed, the whole operation becomes vulnerable. Transparency is the enemy of corruption. Third, watch out for media narratives. You've lived long enough to know that what you see on TV and what's actually happening in the world are often two different things. Trust your own eyes. Trust your own experience. Seek out diverse sources of information. Don't let anyone tell you that what you're seeing isn't real. Fourth, ideologies require infrastructure. An idea by itself might be powerful, but it can't throw a brick. It can't coordinate an attack. It can't sustain a movement. Ideas need organization, funding, logistics. When you dismantle that infrastructure, you defang the ideology. It might not kill it, but it makes it far less dangerous. And fifth, your voice matters. I know it's easy to feel like the big forces in society, the billionaires, the politicians, the media empires are the ones making all the decisions. But they're not. Communities are built from the ground up. Culture is shaped by millions of individual choices. When you stand up for what's right, when you refuse to be intimidated, when you engage in the civic life of your town and your neighborhood, you're exercising real power. So here's what I want you to take away from all this. The crackdown on ANTIFA is significant. It represents a turning point. For the first time, the federal government is treating organized domestic militancy with the seriousness it deserves. The arrests, the terrorism charges, the investigations into funding all of it, signals that the era of excusing and enabling political violence is over. Will it completely eliminate the threat? Probably not. There will still be individuals who cling to extremist ideologies. There will still be attempts to organize, but the large-scale, coordinated operations, the kind that burn cities and terrorize communities, those are being systematically dismantled. And that's a good thing. That's something worth supporting. Because at the end of the day, what we all want is to live in communities where we feel safe, where small businesses can thrive, where families can raise kids without fear, where disagreements are settled through dialogue and democracy, not violence and intimidation. The fall of ANTIFA might not happen overnight. These things rarely do. But history shows us that when funding dries up, when law enforcement stands firm, when communities reject the ideology, even the most dangerous movements can fade away. It takes time, it takes persistence. But it happens. So stay engaged, stay informed, stay hopeful. Because the story we're living through right now, the story of accountability finally arriving after years of chaos, that's a story being written by millions of Americans who simply said, enough. And you're part of that story. Your choice